A car pulls to the line. The engine is barely idling, and it still rattles the fillings in the teeth of everyone standing near the fence. Officials are off to the side, arms crossed, watching this thing the way you'd watch a fuse burning down, because more than once in this story, that fuse reached the end. This isn't a list of cars that simply won races. Winning was the easy part for most of these machines. This is a list of cars that scared the people running the sport itself. Cars that made NHRA officials pack up after a race weekend and go rewrite the rule book before the next event, because what they had just watched wasn't really a competition anymore. It was a warning shot. Every sport has a moment where the athletes get ahead of the rules meant to contain them. Boxing had it. Football had it. Formula One has had it more than once, but nowhere did it happen as fast, as often or as violently as it did in American drag racing, where a garage mechanic with a welding torch and a hunch could show up on a Saturday and single-handedly make an entire sanctioning body rewrite its rulebook by Monday morning. In drag racing, that moment happened again and again, decade after decade, and each time it happened, it had a name, a number, and a quarter-mile of scorched rubber behind it. Today we're counting down the 8 most dangerous cars in NHRA history. The machines that terrified officials so badly, they were forced to change the sport just to survive them. Some of these cars burned, some of them flew. One of them ended a driver's career in a single afternoon. And one of them didn't just break the rulebook, it's the entire reason an iconic class of racing exists at all. Stick around to the end, because number 1 is a car most fans don't even realize was one single machine, and the story behind it changed drag racing forever. Number 8. The 1965 altered wheelbase factory experimental cars. To understand how strange this moment in drag racing was, you have to picture what these cars look like rolling off a factory truck compared to what they look like at the starting line 6 months later. A 1965 Mercury Comet or Dodge Coronet would show up looking almost like something you could buy off a dealer lot. Then engineers would go to work. The front wheels would get pushed forward, sometimes by as much as 10 or 15 inches. The rear wheels would move forward too, tucked further under the car, on paper. This was simple physics. Shift weight rearward under acceleration, plant more of it over the rear tires, and the car leaves the line harder. In practice, it turned these machines into something closer to a seesaw with an engine bolted to it. Ford and Chrysler both pursued this at the same time, almost like they'd made a silent agreement to blow past whatever boundaries existed. Nobody had written a rule against altering a wheelbase by more than a couple of inches, because nobody had ever needed to. That's how fast the engineering moved in this era. The racers were inventing categories faster than officials could name them. What made it worse for tech inspectors is that measuring a wheelbase wasn't as simple as it sounds. Teams would show up with paperwork claiming factory specifications, then quietly modify the chassis in a hotel parking lot the night before qualifying. Inspectors were essentially trying to police an arms race with a tape measure and a clipboard, against mechanics who had every incentive to find the one measurement nobody thought to check. Some crews reportedly kept 2 sets of front suspension components, one set for the pre-race inspection line and a slightly relocated set for actual competition, swapped in the tight window between tech and the first qualifying pass. The result was cars that launched with the front end climbing skyward on nearly every single pass, sometimes for 20, 30, 40 feet before the front tires touched back down. Fans loved it. There's a reason grainy black and white footage from these meets still circulates online. Cars practically standing on their rear bumpers as they rocket down the strip. Officials were far less thrilled, watching cars they were supposed to be safety inspecting behave more like something out of an air show. A car with no front wheels on the ground has no steering input, and no steering input at 120 miles an hour is not a small technical footnote. It's a driver hoping the car drifts back down in a straight line and not into the guardrail. Within a single season, NHRA was forced to draw a line that these altered wheelbase cars had already blown straight past. And in trying to contain that chaos, officials ended up doing something nobody had planned for. They accidentally created an entirely new class of racing. A car that broke the sport's imagination so completely that the sport had no choice but to build a new home for it. We'll come back to exactly how that happened later in this list, because it's a bigger story than most fans realize. Number 7. Dyno Don Nicholson's acid-dipped Maverick. By the early 1970s, one of the open secrets of pro stock racing was acid dipping. Teams would take steel body panels, doors, hoods, fenders, quarter panels, and lower them into vats of acid, letting the chemical eat away at the metal until it was a fraction of its original thickness and weight. Done carefully. It was legal, done aggressively. It was a gamble that could leave a car dangerously fragile in exactly the areas that were supposed to protect the driver in a crash. The chemistry itself wasn't complicated. It's the same basic process used industrially to strip and thin sheet metal. But the judgment call of exactly how long to leave a panel in the tank was where things got dangerous. Leave it in too short a time, and you've barely saved any weight at all, wasting a competitive edge your rivals might already have. Leave it in too long and the acid doesn't stop at thin, it keeps eating. Crew chiefs would pull panels early, tap them with a knuckle, listen to the sound it made, and make a judgment call about whether to dunk it again. There was no gauge for this, it was instinct, nerve, and how much a team was willing to risk. The story that has followed Don Nicholson for more than 50 years involves his Ford Maverick and a body that came out of the acid vat lighter than almost anyone in the pits could quite believe. According to garage legend that's circulated in the sport ever since, when the crew pulled the Maverick's shell out of the tank, the roof and a portion of the A-pillars and C-pillars were essentially all that remained of real structural steel in some sections. The rest had been eaten down to something closer to foil. Some who've told the story over the decades swear you could see daylight through sections of the quarter panels if you held them upright. Officials weighed the car. They remeasured it. They looked it over again. And on paper, nothing about it broke the letter of the rules. But the practice of acid dipping got a hard, industry-wide second look, not long after stories like Nicholson's Maverick started circulating, and within a few seasons, the rules around how much material could legally be removed from a body panel tightened considerably. The era of paper-thin steel bodies, cars that were, in some documented cases, barely holding their shape under their own paint, quietly came to an end. Nicholson never publicly confirmed just how far his own car had gone, and maybe that's exactly the point. Officials weren't just worried about what they could prove, they were worried about what they couldn't, and about what would happen to the driver inside if that razor-thin steel ever met a guardrail at speed. And that's just the two cars that scared officials because of what they could physically do to themselves and their drivers. The next three on this list scared them because of what they were capable of destroying around them, and in one case, what they nearly did to an entire sanctioning body's insurance liability. Number 6. The Ford 427 SOHC Cammer. This is a story that starts with a band that had nothing to do with NHRA at all. In 1964, Ford built a 427 cubic inch overhead cam Vate, a genuinely radical piece of engineering for the era, specifically to answer Chrysler's dominant 426 Hemi on the NASCAR ovals. It was reportedly good for well over 600 horsepower on gasoline and race trim, and NASCAR officials looked at what it threatened to do to competitive parity, and banned special racing engines outright before the Cammer ever turned a single competitive lap in Grand National competition. Think about how remarkable that actually is. This wasn't an engine banned for cheating, or for being unsafe, or for breaking a technical rule. It was banned purely for being too good before it had ever raced a single lap against another car. NASCAR looked at the dyno numbers alone and decided the entire competitive structure of the series couldn't survive it. That's not a penalty, that's a preemptive surrender. Ford now had a fully developed, race-ready engine and nowhere sanctioned to run it, so they did the only thing that made sense. They sent it drag racing instead. In NHRA's factory experimental class, the Cammer found a home that welcomed exactly the kind of radical engineering NASCAR had just rejected. Drivers like Dyno Don Nicholson and Connie Kalitta started campaigning Cammer-powered Comets and Mustangs, and the results were immediate. Nicholson ran mid-10-second quarter miles at speeds pushing 135 miles an hour. Kalitta reportedly became the first driver in NHRA history to run 200 miles an hour at a national event, doing it behind the wheel of a Cammer-powered car. Gas Ronda took the Cammer to a Winter Nationals win in a car that weighed barely over 3,000 pounds. For the crews running these cars, the Cammer wasn't just an engine, it was a small industry unto itself, because it had never been mass-produced for public sale in any real volume. Parts were scarce, expensive, and often hand-machined by whoever on the crew had the most patience. Keeping one alive for an entire season meant building relationships directly with Ford engineers who, in some cases, were quietly still rooting for the engine to prove NASCAR wrong somewhere else, anywhere else, on any track that would have it. What makes the Cammer terrifying isn't just the raw numbers, it's the pattern. This was an engine born from a ban on one side of American motorsport that turned around and started dominating the other side so completely that rival manufacturers began pushing to see it restricted in NHRA competition too, once it started beating their own factory-backed hardware on a weekly basis. An engine too advanced to be allowed to race in one series ended up too dominant to be fully welcomed in another. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when engineering outruns the rulebook twice in the same decade, in two completely different corners of the same sport. Number 5. The 426 Hemi-powered Nitro funny cars of the late 1960s. The Hemi on its own was already a formidable piece of machinery, paired with nitromethane fuel running at percentages that would be almost unthinkable by later safety standards. It turned into something closer to a controlled explosion strapped to a chassis than a conventional engine. Funny cars of this era were built around fiberglass flip-top bodies, sitting over engines that were, quite literally, being pushed to the edge of what the metal could survive. Crew chiefs of the period have described tuning by feel and by sound almost as much as by any gauge, listening for a change in the engine's note that meant something was about to let go, sometimes with only a second or two of warning before it did. Fires were common enough during this period that they became part of the sport's folklore. Cracked blocks, blown head gaskets, superchargers grenading mid-run, all happening at 200 miles an hour, with a driver sitting just feet from the fireball, wrapped in fire-retardant gear that in the earliest years of this era was nowhere near as advanced as what came later. Some of the era's most famous photographs aren't of finish line celebrations. They're of cars engulfed in flame halfway down the strip, the driver already scrambling out of the cockpit before the car has even come to a full stop. Safety crews sprinting alongside with extinguishers that always seem to arrive a half-second slower than anyone would have liked. Officials spent years chasing this problem, and they chased it in pieces because there wasn't one single fix. Fuel percentage caps came first, trying to rein in exactly how much nitromethane a team could legally run. Mandatory fire suits followed, then improved parachute requirements, then roll cage and fuel cell regulations that read today like they were written in direct response to a very specific and very literal list of things that had gone wrong on a strip somewhere. Almost every safety rule from this era of NHRA history has an unspoken origin story, and that origin story usually involves a fire, a stretcher, and a driver who was either lucky enough to walk away or wasn't. Every car so far on this list scared officials because of what it could do on a good run. The next one scared them because of what happened on one catastrophic run, a single afternoon that changed drag racing permanently, and forced a rule change that no amount of lobbying, complaining, or nostalgia could ever reverse. Number 4, Don Garlett's front-engine dragster. Before 1970, for the entire first era of top fuel racing, the layout of a dragster was something nobody seriously questioned. The engine sat in front, the driver sat behind it, often with little more than a few feet of chassis rail, separating their legs from a spinning aluminum drive shaft running at engine speed, connecting the transmission to the rear axle. Everybody in the sport understood, at least on some level, that this arrangement put the driver in a genuinely precarious spot if something let go mechanically. Veteran racers of the era have talked about it almost casually in later interviews. The drive shaft was just something you sat next to, the same way you might sit next to a running chainsaw and try not to think about it too hard, and yet nobody moved to change it. For the same reason, dangerous traditions often survive in any sport. It had always been done that way, and it had mostly worked. Then in March of 1970, at a national event, the transmission in Don Garlett's dragster failed catastrophically. The exploding transmission tore through the chassis directly in front of him, and the aftermath cost Garlits half his right foot. He survived barely, and only because of how quickly he was pulled from the wreck. But the injury was severe enough that it forced a reckoning the entire sport had been quietly avoiding for over a decade. What's remarkable is what Garlits did next. This wasn't a driver who quietly retired and let someone else fix the problem. Still recovering, he became one of the loudest voices pushing for the entire sport to abandon the front engine layout, using his own injury as the argument nobody could talk their way around. When Big Daddy himself, the winningest, most respected name in Top Fuel, says the car design nearly killed him and needs to change, the rest of the garage listens in a way they wouldn't for almost anyone else. Within a remarkably short window after Garlits' crash, Top Fuel dragsters across the entire sport shifted to a rear engine layout, moving the driver in front of the engine instead of behind it. It's rare in the history of any motorsport for a single moment to force an entire category to redesign itself almost overnight. But the danger of the front-engine dragster hadn't been a secret. It had been an open one, tolerated for years, and officials and racers alike only acted decisively once that danger became something they could no longer look past. Garlits didn't just survive a crash. He effectively ended an entire era of dragster design with his own body as the final piece of evidence nobody could argue with, and every rear-engine Top Fuel car that's crossed a finish line since owes its layout in some part to that single afternoon. Number 3. Bill Jenkins' loophole built Vega. Every era of pro stock has had its rules lawyer, and in the early to mid-1970s that was Bill Grumpy Jenkins. He didn't build cars that broke the rulebook outright. He built cars that found the gaps nobody else had noticed: legal weight placement, engine setback measurements, chassis details that technically complied with every line of the NHRA rulebook while still delivering an advantage no one else on the grid had figured out how to extract yet. Jenkins reportedly spent as much time reading and rereading the rulebook, line by line, as he did with a wrench in his hand, treating it less like a set of restrictions and more like a puzzle with a solution hiding somewhere in the fine print. Competitors who raced against him during this stretch have described the frustration of losing not to a faster engine necessarily, but to a car that had simply been built by someone who understood the rulebook better than the people who wrote it. His Chevrolet Vega, built around exactly this kind of careful reading of the rules, simply out-accelerated the rest of the pro stock field for a stretch of time that felt, to Jenkins' competitors, deeply unfair. It wasn't illegal. That was almost the most frustrating part for everyone racing against him. It was smarter than the rulebook, which meant there was no protest that could take it away from him. Teams would file complaints, officials would inspect the car top to bottom, and every single time, the inspection would come back clean. Legal, on paper, every time. Officials closed the specific loopholes Jenkins had exploited about as fast as they identified them, tightening language around weight distribution and engine placement in the seasons that followed. But by the time those changes landed, the Vega had already rewritten what a competitive pro stock launch was supposed to look like, and every builder in the class spent the next several years trying to catch up to a standard one car, and one very sharp mind had already set. Number 2, the wheelie bar era pro stock cars of the early 1970s, as teams across pro stock chased better weight transfer off the line. Front ends started lifting higher and staying airborne longer, and some cars were running meaningful stretches of the quarter mile on the rear wheels alone. Front tires several inches off the pavement. Wheelie bars scraping the surface as the only thing keeping the whole car from flipping backward entirely. It made for an unbelievable show. Crowds loved it in a way that's hard to overstate. A car launching hard enough to stand on its rear wheels is the kind of image that sells tickets and photographs, the kind of moment that gets a car's name repeated in the stands long after the run is over. Track promoters, if anything, quietly encouraged it, because nothing filled grandstands quite like the promise of seeing a car try to loop itself end over end and just barely fail to. But it was also an increasingly unpredictable situation for everyone involved, because a car with no front wheel contact with the ground is a car whose driver has essentially no steering input if it starts to drift offline mid-launch. A wheelie that goes even slightly crooked at 100+ miles an hour has nowhere good to go, and more than one run during this era ended with a car drifting toward the guardrail with the driver able to do little more than hold on and hope the front end came back down before the car ran out of racetrack. Wheelie bar length and geometry restrictions followed not long after, rules specifically written to allow these launches to remain spectacular without letting them tip over into genuinely unrecoverable territory. It's one of the clearer examples in NHRA history of officials trying to preserve the show the fans loved while quietly closing off the version of it that was starting to genuinely worry them. A balancing act between what sells tickets and what a sanctioning body can defend if something finally goes wrong in front of a full grandstand. Every car on this list so far taught officials something the hard way through a near miss, a fire, or a crash. But number one didn't just teach the sport a lesson. It's the reason an entire class of NHRA racing exists at all. And most fans watching it today have no idea how close it came to simply not existing in any organized form. Number 1, the 1965 factory experimental funny cars, full stop. We touched on the altered wheelbase cars back at number 8, but by the middle of the 1965 season, that phenomenon had outgrown anything close to what most fans would recognize as a stock-bodied automobile. Fiberglass panels started replacing steel tube chassis. Work began creeping in underneath what were technically still production sheet metal shells. Engines were pushed forward for weight transfer to a degree that would have been unrecognizable to the car's original engineers. Wheelbases were stretched by whatever margin got the best 60-foot time, regardless of what the factory blueprint originally called for. These cars were still wearing Comet, Mustang, and Barracuda badges, but in name only. Underneath, they were purpose-built race machines wearing a factory car's skin like a costume. Built by crews who understood that the rulebook hadn't caught up to what was technically possible yet, and who intended to exploit every single day of that gap. Fans on the sidelines started calling them funny cars, because that's genuinely what they looked like, familiar shapes stretched and reshaped just enough to feel wrong, like a photograph that's been altered but you can't immediately say how. Something about the proportions was off in a way that made your eye do a double take, even if you couldn't articulate why. The name was meant half as a joke, tossed around trackside between runs. It stuck harder than anyone who coined it ever expected, NHRA officials. Along with the match race promoters who were suddenly filling grandstands with these machines, found themselves staring at a category that had essentially outgrown every rule written for it in real time. There was no realistic path to force these cars back into their original stock class boxes. The engineering had moved too far, too fast, and trying to claw it backward would have meant undoing years of factory investment and fan excitement in one stroke, likely driving the manufacturers themselves to pull their money and their engineering talent elsewhere entirely. So rather than force the impossible, officials did something smarter. They gave the category its own box instead. Funny car became a permanent, sanctioned NHRA class, not because anyone at NHRA sat down and planned it that way years in advance, but because one line of increasingly radical, increasingly unrecognizable factory experimentals made the old rulebook completely obsolete within the span of a single season. The cars that terrified officials the most weren't punished into extinction. They were powerful enough, popular enough, and simply too far ahead of the sport's existing structure to be anything other than absorbed into it. Drag racing didn't defeat this car. It had to build an entire new category just to survive it, and 60 years later, funny car remains one of the marquee classes in the entire sport, a permanent monument to a rulebook that simply couldn't keep up. Here's the thing about every single car on this list. None of them set out to be dangerous. Every one of them set out to be fast, faster than the car in the next lane, faster than last season's best time, faster than whatever the rulebook assumed was possible when it was written. And fast, it turns out, has a way of finding the exact edge of what a sport is actually prepared to handle. Every rule NHRA has ever put in writing exists because a car like one of these came along first and asked a question nobody had thought to ask yet. Nobody sat down in an office and preemptively wrote a limit on wheelbase alterations before 1965. Nobody wrote acid dipping restrictions before a body came out of a vat lighter than anyone was comfortable with. Nobody moved the driver behind the engine until a transmission explosion made the alternative unthinkable. In almost every case on this list, the rule arrived exactly one racing season too late to prevent the thing it was written to prevent, and exactly in time to stop it from happening again. That's the real, uncomfortable truth buried inside drag racing's history. It was never really the officials writing the rules first and the racers simply following along behind them. It was almost always the other way around, a garage full of racers pushing an idea until something gave, sometimes literally, and the sport rebuilding itself around whatever they'd just proven was possible or survivable or both. The rule book you'd read today, page by page, is basically a scar tissue map of every car that came before it and terrified somebody badly enough to change something. Every restriction has a story behind it, and most of those stories involve a driver who had no idea in the moment that they were about to rewrite the sport. They just wanted to win on Saturday. The history came later, and somewhere out there right now, in a garage nobody's watching yet, somebody is probably building the next one, reading the current rulebook the same way Jenkins once did, looking for the one gap nobody else has noticed, completely unaware that in 50 years their car might be number one on a list just like this one.